funds accordingly. Next slide, please. So for the first, for today, for the first budget retreat, day one, what it'll do, it'll set the base for our budget discussion. It will introduce the 2022 budget issues that we'll bring forward to for you all to take a look at. We'll talk about and provide fund histories and projections for the board, and we'll provide an overview of the 2018 and 2022 strategic directions, the performance measures, accomplishments, and that'll lead us to a discussion for the 2022 direction. Next slide, please. And then for the budget retreat, day 2 on May 12th, what we'll do at that time is focus on the 2022 budget planning, and that'll be our goal for that day. We'll provide information on revenue sources and obtain the board's input on ongoing and one-time resource allocations. Oh, that's the page. There you go. Thank you. And we'll obtain really the board's, change again. We'll obtain the board's input to guide the direction for our 2022 budget. So we'll focus on the current service level considerations. We'll focus on the maximum property tax levy request. And then, of course, we'll hear from you as our board, other board directions and considerations. Some of the things that we really want to make sure, key information by this end of this budget retreat, is from our commissioners, from you commissioners, the priorities within the strategic directions and the performance goals, the direction to link the priorities to property taxes, other ongoing funding or one-time funding, and of course, commissioners, the direction for the MPRB maximum property tax levy request. Next slide, please. With that, I am going to turn this over to Jennifer Ringgold, Deputy Superintendent Jennifer Ringgold, to keep moving us forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent. I am going to take a moment to walk us through the timeline for budget development. I believe commissioners have also received the budget calendar, but this is just kind of a process of looking at how the timeline works. And there's really 3 key categories of work. There's the information gathering and sharing. And in this part of budget development, which is right where we are right now, we're looking at projections, we're holding retreats with the board, getting a better understanding of what their priorities are. We'll have a preview meeting with the mayor to understand what, where there's synergy, where there might be things that aren't supported, but trying to get an understanding of the mayor's review of where things are moving in the city. We have information sessions, so we let staff know what we've shared with commissioners. And then last year we started this, and we will do it again this year. We have budget workshops with staff where they're able to provide input into the budget, and all staff across the organization are able to participate in those. And then we have the actual mayoral budget meeting where we get some additional direction directly from the mayor. And I should have actually stated in that first preview meeting, the mayor may or may not be in that meeting. Then we move after that phase, the information gathering and sharing phase, into development phase. And this is where, by this time, we have a sense of the maximum tax levy that the board is wanting to push toward. We have a sense of kind of where the city priorities are, where the board priorities are. We've had the budget workshops. Now staff at the department level start identifying actual budget requests and budget impacts based on the guidance and direction given to them by the superintendent. And that during that time, as we are refining that budget piece, during that time, usually the mayor's recommended budget comes out. This year it's scheduled for August 13th. We start to get a sense in that moment in terms of, you know, exactly what the mayor is or is not supporting. We then dive a little bit deeper into the development of the recommended budget, and then on September 29th is when the BET sets the maximum property tax levy for 2022. This then takes us into the review and amendments, which some individuals have also called the commissioner markup time. So on October 20th is when the superintendent will deliver his recommended budget. So all of the work up to date, he will be delivering his recommendation based on the information he's gathered to date. We will share that recommended budget with staff in employee sessions. And then we begin our process of working through committee and then to the full board. So there will be an admin finance committee meeting on November 3rd. There will be a full board meeting on November 17th. There has been an additional, it's just the spacing. There will be an admin finance where we actually get to hopefully committee approval on December 1st. And then full board approval, that is what has traditionally happened at City Hall. Last year it happened virtually, would happen on December 8th. And now I believe I hand this over to the superintendent.
That's me. Thank you, Jennifer. I want to briefly talk about our youth investment and our MPRB commitment. So the 2022 budget discussion really marks the 4th year of working towards the increase in funding for youth in Minneapolis. The Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board and the city, I truly believe, have the responsibility to invest in, to serve our youth in ways that make substantial differences today and for generations to come. Existing planning and community engagement points to the need and desire to focus on youth. I know I've talked about this for the last 2.5 years that I've been here, and there's no question that our conversations, all of the research points to this need to focus on our youth. And through COVID, we recognized and we watched an uptick in youth violence, and that really shined the light on the need for more services and opportunities for our youth in the city of Minneapolis. And we are uniquely positioned, the Park Board, to do that work. And as I said, the next thing, that we are positioned and we have the solutions in places to enrich the lives of Minneapolis youth. Our 47 recreation centers and the commitment to youth employment. And as we all know, our centers are strategically placed within a walk shot of less than 10 minutes to every rec center. A child can get off the bus, leave their house after school, come to our recreation centers, and we would provide them with opportunities, the programming, the mentorship, all the things that we do incredibly well, and opportunities for jobs. So we're committed, we remain committed to work with this board. We're committed to work with the mayor. We're committed to work with our city council members, our partners at the public school and the leaders, and our partners to establish sustainable youth investment going forward into the future, so that our community and our youth know that we are committed to them and we are investing in them in perpetuity year after year. With that, I'm going to turn this over now to Assistant Superintendent Tyrese Cox, who will talk about youth investment.
Thank you, Superintendent. Good evening, Commissioners. Can we go to the next slide, please? We're going to talk briefly about some of the milestones with the youth investments. Next slide. So the MPRB has demonstrated a commitment to meeting the needs of youth in the city, but a minimum of $2 million annually is needed to close a gap in the recreation funding for youth programming. So the slide in front of you shows how programming hours has changed over the years. It has continuously increased, and thus leaving a gap in the funds received versus the amount of hours we're serving youth in the centers. Some places you are seeing as much as 17 hours a week difference, 20 hours, 11, 17. And this is just a snapshot across the 47 rec centers. Next slide, please. So the gap from 2001 to 19, rec centers have gone from 66 employees down to 46 full-time employees. There is a gap of 20 full-time and 2.632 part-time employees. Youth line has gone from 17 down to 12, and we've talked about that quite a bit over the past couple of years. There is approximately a $3.4 million gap in funding in 2019. And so of that amount, approximately 2 million of the gap will serve youth. Next slide, please.
Could I ask briefly, just for a clarification on that, a gap in 2019 dollars, or what is 29? Does that just mean that the amount would be higher than that based upon inflation, or higher than that based upon shifts in service now in 2021?
I believe that is a combination of, but I may need to defer to Director Wiseman.
President Colgill and commissioners, the gap is related to 2019 dollars. So with inflation, it would be considered more.
Okay. And so when we're speaking to the city, are we using 2019 dollars, or are we adjusting that amount?
For the purposes of this evening, we are just reporting out of what was reported within the Closing the Gap report.
Got it.
But yes, when we are talking with the city, we're talking specifically about the needs around the dollars that we would need in 2022.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Director Wiseman. Next slide, please. So what program will fill the gap? We've talked extensively about the 6 pillars. And just as a reminder, the creation spaces, youth enrichment through community-focused employment, nature programming, cycling, community gardening, and intergenerational centers of excellence. Next slide, please. So the board approved direction focused on youth programming and employment, protected and grew MPRB resources dedicated to youth. 15.9% of the budget in 2018 to 17.7% in 2021. So the requests you've requested that we work with others to reduce duplication in services, and we responded by participating in the mayor's Minneapolis Youth Investment Task Force. We sustained partnerships with MPS, Hennepin County, the Youth Coordinating Board, Minneapolis Parks Foundation, and recognized needs to build resilient systems with some overlaps. Next slide, please. And I believe the next slide is Director Wiseman.
It's me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Cox. So some of the milestones in pursuit of youth investment I want to touch upon also, in kind of a continuation what Assistant Superintendent Cox just mentioned at the end of the last slide. We had a request to look within for efficiencies. We responded. We did a reorganization that increased accountability and reduced overhead in favor of frontline service. We had a request to leverage private dollars. We responded. We created grants, donation, and programs collaboration administration position. And we're off to a great start with that role at this time. We had a request to demonstrate or pilot what you can do with additional investments. We responded and we opened and rehabilitated our creation space at Powderhorn Park. I know this board has seen a brief video of a young lady that was down there performing, and we redid that entire space. Very proud of that. We launched the Imagine Your Future, which Assistant Superintendent Cox presented to this board, which is a very innovative, forward-thinking program that we're going to do with 2 cohorts of 15 youth. Very excited about that. And redefined our youth employment program. And as you all know, board, we moved that youth employment opportunities now into the environmental services area underneath the leadership of Marilyn Paulsher and Pilger and Jeremy Barrick in that area, looking at green infrastructure, jobs and opportunities. So we have a whole new level of work and some exciting things that are coming forward around the redefining of our youth employment program. Still working across our entire organization, but some really great things that are happening there. So in 2022, we are poised, Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board is poised to implement sustainable youth investment through an increase in the MPRB's property tax levy. So with that, I'm going to turn over the next slide over to Deputy Superintendent Jennifer Ringgold.
Thank you, Superintendent Bangora. I too am very proud of the work we've done so far towards the youth and look forward to more that we would be able to do with additional tax levy. I'm going to start us off on some of the other budget issues that are facing us as the Minneapolis park system and that we want to make sure are at the forefront of commissioners' thinkings as well. So, of course, 2021 was a year where the pandemic came into our lives and changed a lot of how we operate. And I'm hoping, whereas this year we're reporting we're a year into our response to the pandemic, I'm hoping next year we're a year out of it, with any luck. But in truth, we really continue to focus on at least 3 areas as we think about the budget. One of us is our service delivery impacts. Throughout 2020 and into 2021, we have had to re-envision our programs and services. We've had to move towards social distance programming, outdoor programming, and virtual programming. And we are hoping that with vaccinations coming online and with other routes in which the pandemic has been attempting to manage it with mask wearing and other items, that we're able to start and continue, actually I shouldn't say start, continue to move toward more service delivery as normal. We will likely, however, continue to incorporate some of the virtual programming and outdoor programming that we've been able to launch during this time period into the future. Financially, there have been, for our organization, things that were both surprising, things that were surged, and things that were less successful during this time period. We had significant increases, for example, in outdoor use, and golf saw a resurgence. Those were things that moved in that direction. We saw a decrease in our ability to collect dollars from programming or fee-based type programming that would require being within buildings. We also were able to establish budget frameworks that helped us stay on track, especially with items like continuing to not lose ground on youth funding. We were able to secure and will continue to look as we move into 2022 for funding, for relief funding. Perhaps the surprise for us is that property tax level stayed strong, and property tax collection stayed strong. And we, while in previous years might have felt like we weren't diversified enough in our funding, having a strong property tax base support of our operation actually provided us with a lot of security in the last year. Economic impacts, as we look into 2022, we do not know yet how the pandemic is fully going to impact our economy, both on a country and worldwide phenomenon. We are still receiving quite a bit of federal stimulus. We are still having supports put into our economy that keep us a little bit more afloat, and so we don't know exactly how things will change as we move into 2022, but we will continue to keep an eye on that. And with that, I will hand it over to, and I think he just came on, so this will be an opportunity to see if there's any technical difficulties as well, but Assistant Superintendent Schroeder.
Thank you, Deputy or Secretary. I am here. So other budget issues we deal with are the continuing expansion of the park system. expansion, trying to fill those gaps that have been identified through our service area master plans and our regional park master plans. We've identified several here, but it builds on the work that we did at Towerside and CPRO last year. And as we move into this year, we'll be looking at adding in the North Loop park, a new park in the North Loop, and continuing to implement aspects of what's called the 8th Avenue Streamscape. As we look across the North Service area, we have the Upper Harbor Terminal, and there are other park additions that are discussed in the North Service Area Master Plan, but we haven't actually moved towards implementing those yet. And we look at parks like Graco along the riverfront, which will happen next year, and Upper Harbor Terminal, which will probably be happening in 2024. And in that, I shouldn't overlook Market Square, which was delivered to us by Hennepin County through a parkland dedication, also filling a gap that was identified in the South Service Area Master Plan, and that will be coming on in October of this year. So even relative to some of the things that Secretary Ringgold was just walking through, we continue to grow our park system very incrementally, with the exception of the Upper Harbor Terminal. Most of these additions are relatively small or very small, and that's what we might continue to see in the future. But they do present questions over the budget. We still need to take care of them. And as we look at some of these, look at the North Loop Park and Market Square, they are in high growth areas, high growth corridors identified in the city.
The next budget issue that you'll find in your materials is related to the enterprise fund. Again, the enterprise fund we have been doing some really detailed focus on since about 2012, trying to make sure items that are meant to be an enterprise are an enterprise, and items that aren't are moved into the general fund. This work will continue, hopefully, into 2022 as we continue to work to stabilize that fund. And again, this fund is intended for the items in it to be completely self-supporting with no tax support. That would include operations, capital, and any debt service related to it. The areas that we are continuing to keep our eye on, or maybe the one area in particular we're continuing to keep our eye on, is the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden. We've really hoped that as we would move into a renovated garden, we would be able to secure programming and vending strategies that would allow us to secure revenue at a rate that would count for the costs associated with the garden. We do expect to bring a few agreements forward for the garden this year and hope that that can takes us closer to meeting the costs associated with providing that garden. If not, there will need to be a longer-term conversation with the board about whether or not we move that amenity into the general fund. This year, Waterworks will get off to its new start. We're very excited about it. The contractual agreements that we have around Waterworks actually establishes it as a micro enterprise. There's a 5-year pro forma associated with Waterworks that attempts to move it into paying for itself within that 5-year time period. So there will be, in these first few years, an expectation that other parts of the fund will need to help offset the costs of it, but the intent is for it to be either breaking even or making money over time. The superintendent continues to keep his eye on golf operations. This is one that has probably stirred a lot of thoughts, emotions, ideas throughout the last year or so, and yet it is an area we need to continue to focus, and probably one of the first and most challenging pieces is for the superintendent to have us all try to look through a similar lens on what maybe the issues are with golf so we can collectively solve them together. And with that, we will move back to Assistant Superintendent Schroeder. He and I will just volley here for a few.
As we look at the system, even though we have been investing in the system through our MPP 20 program, there remain capital investment needs that have fallen outside of that. If you recall, or if for those who are tracking it, when we established the MPP 20 program, it was an amount of dollars through the city that was less than what we were originally seeking, about $4 million less. And it left us in some conditions, in some instances, lacking for all the funds we would need to do to catch up with all of the things that need to go on. So this list includes or highlights some of those things that we're trying to catch up with incrementally, and in most cases, probably not keeping up as well as we'd want to. The first one is security and alarm upgrades. This, as we redo buildings, particularly through the ADA improvements, which we've been doing through MPP 20, we've been trying to integrate new systems related to door actuators, and even outside of that, trying to upgrade the ways that we can control the properties through security systems and cameras. Most of you have probably heard from constituents about our parkway paving and lighting program, which has remained essentially stagnant from investments since the 1990s, where we have about $700,000 per year for parkway paving. It doesn't get us very far, and when we run into instances like we did last year, where we ran into macadam, a material that needs to be put into regulated landfills, it puts us further and further behind. We have opportunities for expanding the system through large initiatives like River First, which is looking at the upper river and the need to invest in the river along North and Northeast Minneapolis, which continue to require not only capital, but acquisition dollars. We've been trying incrementally to invest in operations facilities. The Schmidt building was a big step forward, but we have many other facilities which require significant upgrades to really make them usable or comfortable for our employees. We continue to look at infrastructure and utilities, infrastructure being those things like heating and cooling systems in buildings. Below grade infrastructure is a big unknown for us. We've been trying to get a better handle on that. We have some dollars in the NPP 20 program, but certainly not enough to be able to help us resolve all of the infrastructure problems we've been able to identify. Outside of those parks, we have the Enterprise Capital Investment Fund. We've noted that we have significant investment needs in our two ice arenas. Golf has a capital investment need of somewhere between $20 and $25 million to put it where golf staff feel it should be. And we continue to invest in making continuing the need to invest in our vendor operated spaces. We have a limited number of dollars in the land acquisition fund, and where most of that has been focused in the last few years on the upper river. There remains a need to be continuing to invest in properties as they become available and are affordable. And then looking finally at what we've come to call our historic and iconic homes, we believe we have a solution that we can deal with in kind of an exciting way relative to that, but we still need to provide some funding for a program that will be starting hopefully this summer, where we can be putting Minneapolis youth to work with journeyman carpenters to learn trades related to the most immediate need of protecting the envelope of those homes.
I believe now, let's turn over to Assistant Superintendent Jeremy Barrick.
Yes, good evening. Thank you, Superintendent. Good evening, President Kogel and Commissioners. Along with the system expansion and increased maintenance in those places, we also have a couple other, 5 other pressing things that continue to come up that we wanted to point out as budget issues in 2022. Starting with pesticide-free parks analysis, we continue to make incremental changes as alternatives become viable and obtainable within our current operation structure. And we're going to continue to work to reduce the use of landscape pesticides. We did complete a pilot at Worth Golf last summer with Dr. Paul Cook from the University of Wisconsin where he analyzed our chemistries and made recommendations and changed some of our practices. So we've completed that pilot, and the alternatives are in place there. The Fort Snelling Gulf is an ongoing pilot study. We'll continue that this year. But ultimately, the ultimate impacts are not fully realized at this time. We continue to track, monitor, and we'll keep you apprised of that. But pesticide-free park analysis is ongoing. Water quality is something that's coming up more, and it's a bit of an area of growing concern, where we do have 2 lakes currently that are deemed, that have been labeled impaired, and that's Lake Nokomis and Powderhorn Lake. And so each of those lakes is in a bit of a different state, where Nokomis is designated impaired for nutrients and has an EPA-approved plan that requires nutrient reduction. You recall some of the emails in the past, and the CARP project and things like that. So we have things in place at Nokomis where we're working to reduce the nutrients and improve the water quality. And then at Powderhorn Lake, again, that also has been designated impaired for nutrients. It has had blue-green algae blooms in the past. We've been working with the city to plan for a study to get a grip, and then on that lake and what can be done there. And then Cedar Lake has not been designated impaired, but has experienced some algae blooms. We have been working with the watersheds and the city to understand these things, but ultimately, additional funding for diagnostic study of the lakes to address algae will be necessary for us to be able to move on that. The next one is the tree canopy replacement and tree levy. And so recall that between 2011 and 2013, the Forestry Department developed the canopy replacement plan for dealing with the loss of trees. We adopted a levy in 2014 that funded the canopy replacement plan, and this funding was accounted for in a separate special revenue fund and provides staff, tree removal, and tree planting, stump grinding, and equipment. So in 2014, replacements for the tree loss, replacement for tree loss of trees lost in storms were accounted for in that as well. And approximately 5,000 ash trees are removed annually, and the infested are removed, and non-symptomatic are removed as well, and we replant. So 5,000 trees annually. The final year of the levy on this canopy replacement plan is 2022 with the planting. We will plant the remaining 5,000 trees in 2022. And that will put us in a spot where we will have completed all 40,000 ash tree removals and plantings. This, with the levy expiring, the conclusion of the levy, forestry staff will be reduced. Through attrition, we've managed our vacancies to a point where we don't have to lay anyone off in 21 or 22. But this one less crew will ultimately, result in less pruning and tree maintenance throughout the system. Another thing that continues to come up, there's been a strong interest in the tree canopy campaign in Minneapolis. The Minneapolis Tree Advisory Committee has consistently recommended a canopy campaign in their annual reports. The general fund includes a base budget for planting approximately 3,000 trees, which is give or take our natural attrition. But to maintain the public tree canopy, we would say that we should be planting at a 1-to-1 ratio, and that's basically what the general fund covers. If you want to grow the canopy, we would want to increase that investment from to approximately 3-to-1, so 3 trees planted for every tree that's removed, and that would give us a tree planting total of anywhere from 6,000 to 9,000 trees. But again, that will require additional funding to procure the trees, and could potentially fund another crew, pick up the crew we're losing from the levy to make that possible. And then lastly, another one, this is a heads up as this issue is going to continue to rise, the wood processing site. So if you recall, We had a wood processing site at Fort Snelling. It began back in 2008, where we had a lease agreement to process our wood debris and use for biofuel. In 2015, the Veterans Administration opened a residential housing facility adjacent to that wood debris site, which then the two weren't compatible to have housing next to a wood debris site with a wood chipper running. So we spent several years searching for a new location. At the time when we acquired 4022.5 Washington Avenue North, which is the Michael P. Schmidt Operations Center, we identified that as a potential site for relocation of the wood debris site. We went ahead with that in 2017, but in order to do that, a variance had to be obtained from the zoning board that allowed us to process wood debris outdoors rather than in an enclosed building. That variance will expire in 2023, and it's always been our intent that we would find a permanent home for this operation. And so, given the complexity of it and the limitations of identifying and securing a site, additional funds will need to be will likely be needed to fulfill this need as well. And I think I turned it over to Tyrese, but I'm not entirely sure. No, Julie, I think.
Yep.
Julie.
Yep, President Cogill and Commissioners, before we move on to the strategic directions, we wanted just to stop briefly and just see if there was any questions you have for us at this point. Otherwise, we can keep moving forward and we can do it at the end, but we wanted to make sure if there's any pressing questions that you might have, we could answer that for you right now before we move forward.
Thank you, Superintendent. I'll ask commissioners for questions. Raise your hand. Commissioner Severson's first. Go ahead.
Thank you, President Cogill. What that wood processing plant or what Assistant Superintendent Barrick was talking about, is that gas powered, electric powered? How does that process? How do we process them wood chips?
Sure. President Cogill, Commissioner Severson. Right now, it's a machine that I believe is diesel powered. It's a big grinder, and so the trucks drop the wood off, and then there's loaders that move that wood into a tub grinder. The wood's ground up, put into other trucks, and hauled away. So yeah, it's I believe diesel powered.
I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I'd be quite disappointed to see something from South Minneapolis, something that pollutes that much into North Minneapolis, which typically happens when government organizations need to move things around. They typically try to put it in the poorer neighborhoods. We already have 94 running through there. The Michael P. Schmidt Operations Center sits on the Mississippi River. I just say that I hope you guys come up with a different plan for that. We have enough cars and trucks driving through. And we just had a huge fire at Northern Meadows, and this is all within this area. And it's important to me. This is the area I grew up in, and it's a high concern. And I would just ask that you guys find somewhere close to where it's currently at before looking to North Minneapolis. Thanks.
Thanks, Commissioner Severson. Other comments? Commissioner Forney.
I'm sorry, I wasn't unmuted. It was mentioned at the last meeting that revenue was up at the Sculpture Garden. And I was wondering if you could explain maybe why that happened last year, that we had a revenue increase there. Anybody know? Julie? Jennifer?
President Cogill and Commissioner Forney, we will have a slide on the Sculpture Garden later in the presentation if you would want to maybe hold your question until then.
Yep, thank you, sorry.
Very good. Any other questions from other commissioners? I'm not seeing any. I'd have a couple of questions. If you could go back to the budget issues. I know there were a few slides there. So first, sorry, yeah, we have a few things. On the environmental budget issues, Do we have ready to go any sense of what the next steps on pesticide-free parks would be in terms of the funding that would be needed for that? And I believe this question was answered on water quality and lake monitoring. It sounded like we needed the funding to do an analysis to understand the funding. But if you could clarify those two pieces, that would be helpful.
Sure. So on pesticides, basically where we're at now for developing a budget is, again, these incremental changes that we've been able to make. We're getting a sense for how they're performing, right? And so anything that we've been able to do now, we've been able to do within our current budget. As we've reduced the use of herbicides in particular, I'll just be specific. As we've reduced the use of herbicide, and we've taken to more mechanical means, we're getting a sense of how that's working. How effective is it? Are you able to take something out mechanically and it lasts for a year or 2 or 3 years, and then you do it again, and eventually you do get ahead of it and natives take over, and then it's a lower maintenance operation? That's what we're figuring out now. Or is it a case where, no action or mechanical has led to an explosion in the invasives, and now how do we get it under control? It might take a more significant investment of like a restoration project because it's too far gone, or so that's really what we're trying to figure out now. And Kate Ryan and the gardeners continue to work on this. With each year they're looking at what products are coming out that offer an organic alternative. Can we get them? Can we use them? Can we see how they perform? So then the other thing, the Fort Snelling Golf pilot, that's one where we'll be in our second year of following a program of organic herbicide applications in a golf maintenance regime. And again, we'll see how it's performing. We will also get a sense of general costs, right? So 1 year of costs, especially with COVID and the demand for golf, that's a curveball that we have to kind of calculate and figure out, what does this mean for normal everyday golf operations outside of a pandemic. As far as water quality and lake monitoring, the clarification there, yes. So Nokomis, we have a plan for the nutrient impairment and how to work through that. But these blue-green algae blooms are somewhat of a newer phenomenon across the state, not just in Minneapolis and Minneapolis lakes, but across the state as well. And a lot of our lake study and a lot of our work has not focused on algae blooms. It's just focused on nutrient loading. And so lake studies that would look at the specifics of these lakes and specifics in relation to the algae, so that we can begin to develop a plan. I believe at Cedar Lake, there's been call for a alum treatment as a means of managing the blue-green algae, but that is not as simple as we purchase alum and we go have it when we treat the lake. There needs to be an analysis and an estimate and calculation of what is the nutrient level, what's the appropriate amount of alum to reduce that nutrient level. And that's the information that we need in a study to begin any of this.
Got it. That's helpful. So, but to clarify, or not clarify, to just restate what I'm hearing on the pesticide-free parks analysis, we are using just current systems, practices, and budget to make determinations. We're not at a point of investing more dollars to further that necessarily, or thinking about that request.
Yeah, I would say we've shifted our approach, right, to fewer pesticides and herbicides and using organics when they're available. We're going to see what results that gets us over the course of a year or 2 or 3, right? We're switching product. We might not see things change immediately, and we might not get a read on the impact immediately, but over the course of a couple of years, we'll have a better sense of, yes, we can do this and we can continue to do this. We could do this better if we increase either labor or product. So that's where we're at.
Understood. Okay, and then the other question I had is regarding the budget issues on new park spaces. So could I just understand where the guidance is coming for those four things? So there's the guidance for the Upper Harbor Terminal. There's that's within a variety of agreements that we have. The downtown service area, is River First one of the guiding documents, or what are the other?
So President Kogel, when we look at the upper riverfront, and I think this should actually be the third dot point should be the Above the Falls Regional Park, which is largely guided by River First. We do have a small expansion as we look at waterworks and the mezzanine phase of waterworks coming forward. But the greater area that we have relative to the river would be those initiatives that are framed in the River First vision, and then in the Above the Falls Regional Park Master Plan. But the guidance outside of the River First is coming from our service area master plans and our regional park master plans.
Okay. And when we're thinking about this as a budget issue, how does staff think about these investments relative to other improvements in a master plan that aren't about buying space? Are they separate things, or?
They would be separate because what we do in each of our master plans is we have been identifying gaps in service relative to kind of a standard distance that people would be moving. We've considered 6 blocks, but blocks vary in shape and shape and size across the city. But we've been looking at it relative to where there is a gap in park service and trying to move us above the current 98% as measured by TPL. And so that's where these gaps are being filled. If you look at like Market Square or CPRO, for instance, two that happen in the South Service area, both of those parks were identified as within a park search area that was necessary to reduce the gaps in park service. It just happened that Market Square happened at the intersection of two of those park search areas.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions on the first portion of the superintendent's report on budget issues? Not seeing any, so you can continue.
Thank you, President Kogel. And we're turning this over to Director Julie Weissman to continue and moving forward. So thank you, Dr. Weissman.
Thank you, Superintendent. And again, good evening, President Kogel and Commissioners. Before I start my presentation, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping and let you and the public know that all of this information is available on the Park Board website at www.minneapolisparks.org/budget. So all the materials that we are going over tonight, the issues list, the budget calendar, the strategic directions, and copies of these PowerPoint presentations are located on the website. I have also sent out an email to the commissioners that includes the documents, the budget calendar, the issues list, and again, the strategic directions. So the first of the financial information, I'm going to go through each fund, and I'm going to provide a history of the fund as well as projections for that fund. So our general fund is our main operating fund that reports activities that are not reported in other funds. It includes the care and maintenance of the park system, recreation facility operation and programming, planning for development and redevelopment of the park system, park safety and security, executive management, and support services. Next slide, please. We'll start with the general fund history. I will go over general fund revenues first, property taxes, local government aid, and then other revenue sources. So the Park Board property tax levy has increased an average of 4.1% annually over the last 10 years, which includes the tree preservation and reforestation levy that was reinstated in 2014. Assistant Superintendent Jeremy Barrack spoke about that program, that 8-year program that will be, the levy is complete as of 2021, and the final planting will take place in 2022. Next slide, please. The City of Minneapolis property taxes have increased an average of 3.6% annually over that same 10-year period. Next slide. So when we look at the City of Minneapolis and the Park Board's major revenue sources, you'll see that the Park Board is heavily reliant on property taxes, while the City of Minneapolis has more diversified revenue sources, reducing a reliance on property taxes for the city. But I will remind everyone that the impacts of COVID on the city and on the Park Board are directly linked to our ability to raise fees, fines, and other revenues. So in our Park Board, that represents 13% of our general fund budget. At the city, it's 37% of the city's general fund budget. So they are having much more impact from COVID due to the reduction in those revenue sources. Next slide, please. Local government aid, you can see that local government aid has risen from 2012 up to our current dollar amounts. There was a slight decrease in 2021 based on a recalculation of the distribution amongst all of the cities. Next slide, please. In other revenues, this includes our grants and donations and our fees and service fees, our building and ground rentals, and other overhead charges and transfers. So in 2021, the budget includes the $3.3 million of COVID revenue impacts, which this is a great time to say that in this conversation, we are not showing, for budget purposes, the impacts of COVID as we talk through our current service levels and budget projections. Next slide, please. So this shows the percentage of our non-property tax revenues. So you'll see that state aids are 47% of that, and user fees are 26%. Next slide. So now we'll get into our general fund history of expenditures. We'll have our operating budget history, our capital funding, and then some full-time employee charts. So the Park Board's general fund operating budget has increased $32.6 million, or an average of 5.4% over the last 10 years. Fee-based recreation programs moved into the fund in 2013, and the NPP 20 operations of $3 million was added to the general fund in 2017. Increases to health insurance, pension contribution rates, utility costs directly reduce the amount of funding available for programs and services. Recent increases in state aid, property tax revenues, and the moderating of health insurance increases has helped to improve Park Board finances. Next slide, please. So these charts show our operating expenditures reflection from 2012 to 2021. As the workforce has recovered from a low point in 2012 and minimum wage has increased, salary and fringe spending has become a larger percentage of our operating budget. Next slide, please. So this chart shows our full-time employees, and this is for all funds. And you can see the impacts of the recession that occurred between 2006 and 2012, where we lost 117 full-time employees, or 20% of the workforce. Since 2012, the workforce has been increased by 122 full-time positions, including the 45 positions that were added when NPP 20 came online. Next slide, please. So this chart shows our youth employment for all funds. And in the past, I have talked about how the recessions that our youth employment were not impacted during times of recession, but you can definitely see on this chart for 2020 that our youth employment was very much impacted by COVID. And so although we had increased investments for youth employment, where we had budgeted up to 1,000 youth being able to work for the park board, because of the impacts of COVID and the inability to provide programs and services in 2020, ultimately did not allow for youth employment to become at the budgeted levels. Next slide. So now we'll get into the general fund budget outlook. Next slide. The state legislative update on the general fund operating side. The state budget situation has improved dramatically since 2020. The current forecast is a surplus of 1.6 billion. The governor and legislatures are working to pass a budget by May 17th. At this point, local government aid is expected to be unchanged in 2022 and be at the same level as what is budgeted in 2021. There has been a bill introduced that would potentially fund 40% of the Metro Parks operations and maintenance costs, as should be allowed by the state. And if that was enacted, this could increase the park board revenue by 7.5 million. Next slide, please. On the city side, the city of Minneapolis revenues, as I spoke to before, where the city is more heavily reliant on fees and service charges. The city is in their long range projections, projecting a steady growth in revenues with a return to the pre-pandemic levels in 2024. The mayor's 2022 budget priorities are public safety, affordable housing, and economic inclusion. The city is expecting to receive $281 million in relief funds through the American Rescue Plan Act, which can replace lost revenue through 2024. So on the city side of budgeting, the American Rescue Plan will help supplement those lost revenues, as last year they were looking at raising property taxes because of those lost revenues. But with the relief funds coming forward in the American Rescue Plan, that will no longer be a need for the city going into future years. The city of Minneapolis 5 years financial projection calls for a park board property tax levy increase of 4%. during the years 2022 through 2026. And then the city of Minneapolis overall property tax levy increases of 5.4% to a low of 3.8% in 2026. The chart that I am showing here is the city is projecting our 2022 property tax levy at the $73.1 million. So it has the overall change of 4%. However, for the Minneapolis Park Board levy, which is our general fund levy, this is a 6.1% increase to our general fund. Next slide, please. In 2018, we moved to being self-insured for health insurance costs, and the city is projecting a 5% annual increase, but savings should begin to be realized from the move to a self-insured plan. And then we have the minimum wage ordinance with the impact to 2022 being $436,000 in our general fund. Next slide, please. So here are our general fund 5-year projections, beginning with our projection for 2022 with a general fund property tax levy increase of the 6.1%. So this is our current service level budget for 2022, which means providing the same level of services that were budgeted for in 2021 at the 2022 levels, and also providing current service levels for our system expansion. So you'll see on the revenue side, a 6.1% increase in property taxes, local government aid at the same level, and holding steady on our fees, fines, and other revenues. And again, we are not showing an impact due to COVID in these current service level projections. And then then we have our expenditures going up, and that's based on a projection of increases for unsettled contracts, as most of our labor unions contracts will be expiring on December 31st, 2021. So we will begin negotiating with our unions. We have the health insurance increase, a small inflationary increase to other expenditures. Next slide. So what is included in our current service level? We have additional property tax revenue of $4.1 million. Most of that is allocated towards our provision for wage and benefit adjustments. So again, as I said, that is for unsettled union contracts, step increases, benefit increases, the minimum wage increases, all of those things are recorded in that number. We have other operating expenditure increases, and then we have an increase to forestry, trees, and stumps to bring us back to the special levy numbers. So the approximately 3,000 trees planted, supported by the general fund. Our minimum wage increase, and then the costs associated with the new park operations at the downtown areas, the North Loop, 8th Avenue, and Market Square. So as you start thinking about the maximum property tax levy, know that the current service level is the 6.1% for the general fund. It's an overall 4% increase with the reduction or the elimination or the completion of the tree levy. And it's a 0.7% increase for the total city of Minneapolis property taxes. As you think about your priorities and things that you might want to direct towards property taxes, youth investment, as we have been talking about, a 1% increase in property taxes would generate just under $700,000 in revenue, and is a 0.2 increase to the city of Minneapolis overall property taxes. The $1 million increase in property taxes is a 1.5% increase on park board property taxes and a 0.3% increase to the overall total city of Minneapolis tax. Next slide. Before we move on to the other funds, do we have questions on the general fund?
Do commissioners have questions on Director Wiseman's presentation? Any questions? Not seeing any. Thank you.
Great. So I will continue with the special revenue funds. Next slide. So our special revenue funds are established to account for resources designated for specific purposes. The Park Grant and Dedicated Revenue Fund accounts for grants and other revenues that have been designated through grantor requirements, donor request, ordinance, or board direction. The Park Grant and Dedicated Revenue Fund activities include grants and donations for non-capital activities, self-supporting community events, park land acquisition, O&M lottery proceeds, and park dedication. Next slide, please. So again, the tree preservation and reforestation levy is a special levy that funded an 8-year program that is going to be completed. Next slide, please. So this shows our budget estimate for the Park Grant and Dedicated Revenue Fund. The grant and dedicated revenue budget is adjusted throughout the year as grants, donations, and land sale revenue is received. Next slide, please. The park dedication funding, you'll see between 2014 to 2020, we have accumulated over $22 million in revenue, and we are starting to allocate those park dedication fees out through the CIP program, as well as we acquire new parks in the areas where development is occurring. And the board has approved a significant land purchase that will be funded through park dedication fees in 2021. Next slide, please. Here we have the tree forestation, preservation and reforestation levy. Next slide, please. So what's important here is that 2021 is the last year of the levy. There is planting that will occur in the spring of 2022, and we will be using the tree levy fund balance in order to complete that program and do the planting in 2022. Next slide. Moving into our internal services funds. Next slide. We have 3 internal services funds. We have our internal services funds for equipment and information technology services. And then we have our park self-insurance fund. Next slide. Information technology services, our IT budget. You will see our budget history where the revenues are obtained from the other departments to fund technology initiatives, including hardware, software, network connectivity, wireless access servers, mobile devices, and multifunctional devices and equipment. The Park Board has increased its investment in technology over the past 10 years, including upgrades in the point of sale system, mobile devices, wireless access, network infrastructure and redundancy, and asset management system. An increasing workforce has also required additional technology. The 2021 budget includes upgrades to camera, security, and door access systems. Next slide, please. The 2022 ITS budget projections include the current service level plus scheduled hardware replacement and network upgrades. So that's where you see we are projecting in 2022 to use reserve balances to do those upgrades. The 2022 estimated budget includes new infrastructure for desktop and computers. Future budget needs include keeping the technology in the creation spaces current and upgrading the recreation center's computer labs. ITS maintains a reserve fund for technology capital and software replacement and one-time needs. At the end of 2020, the unaudited balance was just under $1 million. This balance is used to smooth out large fluctuations in funding needs when large technology investments are required. Next slide. In our equipment services, we manage the acquisition, maintenance, and disposal of approximately 1,700 units of large and small equipment, primarily the MPRB's fleet of vehicles, including trucks, plows, police vehicles, etc. Since 2012, the Park Board has increased its investment in equipment to modernize its fleet, enhancing operational efficiencies. It also increased equipment rates charged to departments to cover the actual costs of operating and replacing equipment. And again, you will see between 2017 and 2021, there was planned significant investment in the fleet to bring the fleet back up to replacement standards. Next slide, please. The 2022 equipment services budget projection includes the current service level operating expenses and the scheduled equipment replacement. Equipment services maintains a reserve. At the end of 2020, the unaudited reserve balance was over was 4.7 million. This balance is sufficient as a reserve for capital replacement needs and will be reduced by spending in 2021 and future years. Equipment purchases have been limited over the past few years due to issues with the state contract and COVID, which increased the fund balance. Next slide, please. In our self-insurance fund, this covers our liability for activities within the MPRB, which we have chosen to insure. These activities include workers' comp, property loss, general liability, automotive liability, and police professional liability. The majority of this self-insurance fund budget funds workers' compensation claims. The MPRB has been working to increase workplace safety through better use of equipment and better work practices, decreasing the amount of claims since 2021. So you'll see in 2021 that our self-insurance fund budget was reduced, and that is largely due to the savings associated with workers' comp. Next slide, please. The self-insurance budget projections include the current service level operations. The park self-insurance fund maintains a reserve fund balance that is actuarially determined for workers' comp and general liability. At the end of 2020, the unaudited balance was approximately $6 million. This balance is sufficient as a reserve with the liabilities considered and it's considered fully funded. Next slide. So now we'll go into the enterprise fund history. Next slide. So our enterprise fund is established to account for our activities that operate as a business. Enterprise activities are meant to be self-supporting and include operations, capital improvements, and debt service. Enterprise fund activities do not receive property tax support. The activities within the enterprise fund are golf, parking, concessions, ice arenas, permits, and the sculpture garden, and starting in 2022, the waterworks site. A 10-year history of the enterprise fund is next by activity. So here we have golf actuals. So our golf average annual net income between 2001 and 2010 was $834,000. The average net income between 2011 to 2020 was a loss of almost $400,000. You will see the resurgence in golf clearly reflected as golf net income for 2020 was $1.2 million. Next slide. And again, our average rounds of golf between 2011 to 2020 is 171,000 rounds, where between 2021 and 2010, it was 251,000 rounds. And again, you'll see the resurgence of golf noted on this chart as well. Next slide. So our net income for golf operation, our ice arenas operations, our net income for ice arena operations, you'll see that ice arenas were definitely impacted by COVID in 2020 with a severe reduction in net income and a loss of just under $300,000. Next slide. In parking net income, parking has been one of the stable net income providers in the enterprise fund. And while it was impacted by COVID, it was not impacted in as severe as some of the other activities within the enterprise fund. Next slide, please. Use and invest permitting net income. This chart definitely shows the impact of COVID in 2020, where net income, we had a net loss for the first time in that 10-year period directly related to COVID. Next slide. And concessions in income, you'll see that downward trend for concessions net income. Again, we lost the site at Bede-Makaska due to fire, and then the impacts of COVID in 2020, which definitely impacted our concession areas and their ability to generate revenue in 2020. Next slide, please. The sculpture garden it shows our history here. So 2019 to 2020, there's again an impact due to COVID on the revenue side, and we hope that with the turnaround of COVID and with other structural changes that are being made, that the Sculpture Garden will rebound in 2021 and in the future. Next slide, please. So overall, our enterprise net income, you can see that because of the resurgence in golf in 2021, our net income did not decline as far as what we had originally thought it might because of COVID. And again, our operating income funds are non-operating expenses, which include our capital improvements and our debt service. And so those were paid. And part of the reason why our net income in 2020 is 1.3 million is that we reduced some of our improvements and deferred those improvements to 2021. Next slide, please. So our enterprise fund overall, our fund balance, this is an important slide because as we talk about, the enterprise fund should be self-sufficient and provide investments into the assets that are located in the enterprise fund. So we have made a concerted effort to grow the fund balance as we look to the future of the fund and look to making investments in those assets. Next slide, please. This is a chart that outlines the enterprise fund debt service. So this shows the amount of debt that has been paid for through the enterprise fund. And so you'll see the Neiman Sports Complex was being funded out of the enterprise fund, even though the Neiman Sports Complex was not an enterprise function. So that was moved into the CIP back in 2016. You'll also I'll point out that the Parade Ice Improvement debt restructured in 20 You covered it just fine.
Well, and I don't remember when, we quote unquote converted to keeping all assets, all funds, in the enterprise, how long it's been and everything. But I do remember before being on the board and everything that, we were depleting, all these things, that it was going to fund youth, programming, things like that. And that's why things didn't get, the asset wasn't taken care of. So I appreciate, this business way of looking at it, and very, very clear understanding of what's going on here. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Commissioner Forney. Commissioner Severson for the second time.
Thank you, President Coghill. I just had a few more questions. When we talk about the sculpture garden in the midst of COVID, a great, beautiful green space with great art and a place to spread out, how did we lose money there? Does anyone know how we lost money, and is there a plan in the future that that is in place so we generate more money for the enterprise, so that this place isn't a loss? I just, in my head, I'm thinking, in the midst of the pandemic, a great green space, a very unique space, unlike any other part of the city. It's baffling to me how we lost money on that.
President Coghill and Commissioner Severson, again, I'll kind of remind you, the sculpture garden, the revenue stream at the sculpture garden is based on events, public events. So with COVID and the state restrictions on the size of events, that's why you see the dramatic loss of revenue on use and events permitting, and don't see revenue being generated at the sculpture garden.
And that's the same with the ice arenas?
Correct. The ice arenas were closed for a good port, at the beginning of COVID, they were closed. We weren't open at all, and that was kind of during prime hockey season. So there was a lot of revenue that we lost. And then as the ice arenas were able to open up, the capacity was at a very low capacity, and it's slowly been increasing the capacity as state guidelines have been loosened up.
Well, we'll say, I just want to tell the general public and the folks here, I really like the enterprise fund. The more I learn about it, and the more I think that we can improve it. Some of the most interesting things are the fact that, the golf courses may have covered the sculpture garden and the ice arenas this year, but in the past, maybe the ice arena has helped cover golf in the past, right? So I hope that everyone recognizes we have really good assets, and in the future, we really need to invest in these assets to grow the enterprise fund. And I don't think anything is worth losing, in my earnest opinion. I think we have nothing but to gain if in the future we invest in this enterprise fund with great ideas. And maybe we need to be a little more advantageous in our thinking on how to improve our facilities and how to grow them. Thanks.
Thanks, Commissioner Severson. Any other questions or comments from commissioners regarding enterprise? I did want to identify a few things. I'm wondering, first, actually, on this slide, I'm glad that we paused here. Why did the estimate on the debt service for parade ice increase in 2025-26? Is that just how the payment's structured?
President Coghill and commissioners, yes, the debt service at the time that we took on the parade ice debt, we were still paying the Neiman debt out of the enterprise fund. So we structured the parade debt to increase once the Neiman debt was paid off. because the enterprise fund, you know, really can't handle more than about $1 million worth of debt on an annual basis. And so it was structured this way for it to increase in 2021.
Okay. And with Waterworks and the thinking of having this come online, it sounds like that's still being thought about or structured in some way. How would Waterworks be separate from concessions? So we have concessions listed as one thing, and then Waterworks is a totally separate thing. Why would that be?
President Cogill and commissioners, again, Deputy Ringgold, step in if I kind of don't get this quite right. But just like the sculpture garden was meant to be a micro enterprise. So we actually have parking revenues that are generated by the sculpture garden that go into the revenue of the sculpture garden. Any event or concession revenue that happens at the sculpture garden is recorded in the sculpture garden. So the same type of thought is put into the Waterworks site, and there is a pro forma that was developed of how much revenue we feel this site can generate, and then the operating cost needs of the site. And over time, the intent is that this would be a micro enterprise and that it would ultimately make money rather than lose money.
I see. So I kind of am compelled by Commissioner Severson's point around how certain funds might support others at different times, and then also around the principle of attempting to reinvest a good portion of the money generated by certain sites into those same sites. It feels confusing to me that we might have a certain number of, just like half of the enterprise fund to be self-sustaining funds, and then the other half having to sort of like fend for themselves in a large hodgepodge. And that seems like it would be to the benefit of certain, like, maybe viewed as like premier sites, especially with something like the sculpture garden. Like, I certainly want that to succeed, but that's clearly been supported by a variety of other enterprise items for a while. But then once we get it set up, we're going to just keep all the money within that site. That seems like it's not really being consistent with the vision and goal of having this enterprise fund. So I guess I just think that some of these pieces need to be thought through, and clearly the commissioners need to think through this stuff. But I guess if I'm wanting to see anything, it's just consistency. So to think a little bit more about what that looks like.
President Cogill, if I could maybe share a few more thoughts that could help with that. Yep. So when we think of sculpture garden, when we think of Waterworks, and ideally we would actually have each group or each activity in a spot where they're not only covering their operating expenses, but they're covering their debt and they're covering their capital. We have, over time, not managed our enterprise fund in a way where we have set things up. Like we took a lot of money out of golf over the years, so we didn't set up its its capital fund in a way that would actually sustain it, because people assumed it would continue to make revenue hand over fist in the way that it had for many years. So I think now we're trying to rebalance that. Now, when you think of the sculpture garden and you think of Waterworks, and then maybe you think of a Loring Park, and you think of a Loring Park as a space that receives quite a bit of attention and quite a bit of interest for permanent events. But the level to which we can actually do permanent events at that park is limited by many factors. And there's also a lot of other aspects of that park that are more public-facing versus just and non-revenue generating. And so the question starts to become, is the sculpture garden and Waterworks more like a Loring Park, that it should have general fund being its primary supporter, and the revenues that we receive off of any permits in that space might slightly augment it? Or is it something that can generate revenues at the level to which we can actually sustain the whole park? And this is a strategy. You know, one strategy is put it into the general fund, and there is some portion of revenue made off of it. Another strategy is to try to make it be self-sustaining. And when you think about the pressure we have of adding new parks into the system and the concern folks have about how that is going to increase the tax burden of the system, it's just one of the avenues to explore. And so just want to throw some additional thoughts out there in the sense that there are multiple strategies on how we think about bringing these types of facilities online, and each one of them might have their pro and con.
Right. Well, that's helpful. Commissioner Severson.
Thanks for recognizing me again, President Cogill. Julie, who paid the Neiman debt? How was that paid?
Can you go to the debt service slide, please? So the Neiman debt was paid through the enterprise fund up until 2015. And then it was transitioned to the into the CIP, and I believe it was capital levy dollars that paid for it until it was finally paid off.
Okay. President Koga, I mean, I'd be interested in you creating a special committee to oversee this enterprise fund. Maybe we need more of the general public involved for not only the general public, but ourselves to have a better understanding of what exactly the public wants and how we guide and use these dollars. I mean, it could be a significant amount of money if we really think about how to do this right and again, be advantageous on how we move forward. So I would support creating a committee to help oversee the enterprise fund.
Very good. Well, we can continue to talk about that. I think that this is a good conversation. I would say that, you know, the best place for that conversation would probably be in administration and finance. And I certainly think getting more feedback from the public would be good on this issue. I'm not seeing any other hands from any other commissioners, so I'll turn it back over to the superintendent.
Thank you, President Cogill and commissioners. We're going to move into our next section here, which will be around the 2018 and 2022 strategic direction. And we will start with, again, we'll go to Deputy Superintendent or Deputy Superintendent Jennifer Ringgold to start and to work through our strategic direction A, which is our investing in youth. And we will go through each one of our strategic directions, and we will have a discussion after each section. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Deputy Superintendent Jennifer Ringgold. Start.
Thank you, Superintendent Bangora. So strategic directions, one of the first things that the board did coming into office in 2018 was to work to develop and approve its 2018-2022 strategic directions. And those are the directions that guide us into development of the 2022 budget. As we move throughout the year, the strategic directions are integrated into our budget. They're part of our budget goals, and they're part of work plan development in the organization. When Superintendent Bangora came on board, part of the work to bring him on board included, as part of his performance review, having performance goals. So we in 2019 added this concept of performance goals into the organization and into how we do business. And this is a way that we measure our progress towards the strategic directions. They allow us then at a staff level to set milestones on how we're going to get to those. And within the documents you see now, you also see the accomplishments that we summarize both in the budget and at this time of year. Of course, they are also part of the superintendent's review in terms of how we are, as an organization, are performing towards those performance goals. And again, the 2022 budget, this is the final year of this set of strategic directions, and it is what becomes kind of the foundation for the superintendent's recommended 2022 budget. And with that, I am going to hand this over to Assistant Superintendent Cox. She is going to walk through strategic direction A, which is invest in youth.
Thank you, Deputy Ringgold. Actually, I believe that Director Wiseman is going to talk through a few slides, and I'll come back after a couple. Is that right?
I apologize. I may have the wrong cue sheet here. So, Director Wiseman.
That's okay, just a little technical. So for the strategic direction, invest in youth, we have two performance goals. Performance goal A1, which is youth-focused programs supporting the social and emotional career and life skill development of young people ages 2 up to 17. And the performance goal is increasing those programs by 20% by 2022. And then performance goal A2 is investing in youth employment programs for ages 14 to 24 and growing our youth employment by 25% by 2022. Next slide. So I want to talk about the gains that we have made in our youth investment between 2019 and 2021. For our goal A1, the increase to the number of youth-focused programs, we have invested over $200,000 for creation spaces. That's 4 creation spaces throughout our system. This board has put together ongoing funding for the Walt Dietzig Innovation and program fund and other program funds of over $200,000. We have the introduction of the full service community school site. The Youth Line program staff was increased investment. And then we have the free Rec Plus program at Harrison Park. So on the youth program investment, we have invested almost $900,000 of additional funding into youth-focused programs. Of that $900,000, only $150,000 of it, the full service community park school campus, was funded through a property tax levy increase. All other increases were done through decisions by the superintendent and executive team, as well as approval and amendments of this board. Next slide, please. The investment A2 in youth employment, we have made great progress in youth employment with almost an $800,000 investment for youth employment. That's an increase of 209 youth being able to be employed by the Minneapolis Park Board. Our 20% goal is almost matched, where our goal is 228 youth. We are just slightly under that goal. Next slide, please. So again, you have become familiar with this chart as we have wanted to reflect, and you have wanted to reflect in the Park Board's budget, that increase and focus on youth investment. And definitely between 2018 to 2021, we have increased our youth investment from 15.9% of our general fund budget to where it is in the 2021 budget of 17.7%. Next slide. So how did we get there? If we didn't receive any additional property tax dollars, how did we fund $1.6 million of additional youth investment? Again, just a very small part of that, $150,000 of that was a property tax levy increase. Everything else is budget adjustments, and I'll just go through them. We've made revenue adjustments. So we increased revenue and created new fees that were not associated with youth. And that increased our revenues by about $175,000. The Park Police Department received position eliminations and other reductions of just under $300,000. The Planning Division position eliminations is $400,000. Other administrative position eliminations is $200,000. A supervisory position elimination is $100,000. You reduced your lobbying expenses and budget by $76,000. And at the end of, or at the beginning of this year, you made an early pay down of debt service for the Michael P. Schmidt Operations Center and paying off the debt with the Weber Natural Pool, and allocated those payments towards youth. So those are all of the decisions that have been made agency-wide in order to support this investment in youth. Next slide. You also, at the same time, anytime that there was one-time funding available, you have invested additional money towards youth. So again, at the beginning of this year, with the general fund excess fund balance, you have invested another $1 million of one-time money into both youth and some senior programs. Next slide, please. I will turn it over to Assistant Superintendent Cox for this slide.
Thank you, Director Wiseman. So as for staff recommendations, we're requesting $2 million in additional investment through property taxes. Those dollars will focus on frontline staff, those that provide direct service to young people. They will expand and enhance Youth Line. We talked earlier about Youth Line being understaffed from its previous years. It will expand and enhance the creation spaces. As we bring those on, we want to make sure that we stay current and get those off to the appropriate start for the programming. We will expand and enhance nature programs and provide intergenerational programs system-wide. We know that they are happening in pockets, but we want to make sure that we have appropriate intergenerational programming across the city. And then lastly, meet our youth employment goals that are outlined in Goal A2. And I think we're going back to Director Wiseman.
So how would that $2 million potentially look? As we talked about in the Closing the Gap is really in the ability to provide the staffing levels to provide the direct services to our youth. So in this chart, it shows the example of how the staff would recommend distributing that $2 million throughout the superintendent's pillars. And it would add 16 full-time employees to our system. And again, it would be focused on frontline staff that provide direct services to our youth. And it would have youth programming, creation spaces, where we would add an additional 2 spaces and add full-time staffing for the total of 6 creation spaces. And then also intergenerational programming and the amount for youth employment. So again, as we get ready for our day 2 budget planning and start thinking about how we want to direct our priorities and where do we want to direct our priorities, whether it's ongoing funding or one-time funding, this shows that we would really be looking to increase our general fund property tax levy to support this youth investment of $2 million. And we showed the chart where it would be 4% property tax levy increase. To add the $2 million, it would make our property tax levy increase 6.8%, which would equate to a 1.2% property tax citywide. Next slide, please. I'll now turn it over to President Cogill and Superintendent Bangora.
Thank you, Director Weissman and President Cogill and Commissioners. We'll take this time now, since staff have provided the proposal going forward with the $2 million, and it's been defined in what we see the need for programming going forward. And as Director Weissman said, and also Assistant Superintendent Cox said, it's the staffing level to provide those services. But this obviously is your opportunity to respond. We look forward and are asking you now for your priorities around youth, and built that into the 2020-2022 budget. So President Cogill, if I can turn this over to you, and if you would like to lead, obviously the commissioners and we as staff will listen and take copious notes and respond to any questions you have. We look forward to hearing your recommendations around this focus in youth.
Great, thank you, Superintendent. I'll ask commissioners if they have any questions or thoughts regarding the youth investment or the proposal that was brought forward by staff regarding $2 million. I have a few ideas, but I think it would be maybe be good for us to go back to that slide so we just at least see what is being thrown out there right now. Are there any comments or questions? Commissioner Meyer.
I'll just add the same thing that I have said basically every year, which is that I support increasing the property tax levy above the current service level projection, so that we can have a more substantial investment in youth and other priorities that we have. I think we have seen a lot better economic conditions than people were previously anticipating. That doesn't apply to everybody. There are certainly people who are still struggling, but overall the economic conditions are much better than anticipated. And I feel that the type of investments that we would make would have a very positive, equitable distribution. So I'm always going to be a vote in favor of a higher levy to fund those investments. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Meyer. Any other comments from commissioners? Comments or questions? Not seeing any. I would agree with Commissioner Meyer here. So this goes back to, I think, my first question, which is this. We have a Closing the Gap Fund report that identifies a $3.4 million gap in 2019 dollars. Then we're saying that we're just going to lop off basically a little more than half of that and look at just 2 million of that. But again, that's in 2019 dollars, and what I'm seeing here is a proposal for $2 million. So that's not, is that filling that gap identified in the 2019 report?
So President, Yep.
Go ahead.
President Cogill and commissioners, I appreciate you bringing that question up because I meant to address it as I was speaking and then I forgot to. So we have done our work and we have already reinvested in youth by $1.6 million. So this additional $2 million for property taxes would increase that investment overall by $3.6 million in total. We had, in the Closing the Gap, we identified a gap of 26 full-time employees for recreation. This adds 16 back. Over the course of the 3 years, we have added 4 positions to recreation prior to this ask. So that's 20 out of what we feel was the original gap of 26. So it's not quite bringing us back to the pre, the pre levels, the top level, but it's definitely bringing us quite a bit closer to where we want to be.
Okay, that's good. I guess maybe I'm the only one who feels this way, but I feel a little bit like we're negotiating a little bit against ourselves. I know that we're trying to work closely with the city and I understand that strategy, but I also think that we should state what we need. If we have a gap, and it wouldn't be that much more money, but if we have a gap that's another $500,000 than this, that needs to be shown so that we're not in a position where we get this and then next year we have to come forward with a levy, another increase, and the city or the BET says, well, last year you said you were filling the gap with this, right? I think we need to be consistent, at least with our report, since that's what we have been showing out around everywhere. So that would be my one piece of feedback and moving forward. Vice President Vito?
Thank you, President Cogill. I agree. If we have a gap, I think we should just say what we need and, leave it up to negotiation, if that's what it means. But I'd rather just go in, say it, if we get our hearts broken a little bit, that's fine if we have to scale back. But I like that approach also, President Cogill.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate that. And I think that I think that's the only piece right now that I would, at least with these first 2 strategic directions that I'm thinking about, just so that we're staying clear and consistent. On the youth employment, I guess I just ask one more time if any commissioners have any thoughts about what is being proposed in the breakdown of those dollars, with the idea that, perhaps they're augmented, but are there any major concerns? I'm not seeing any hands. Well, we can move on. If there are we going through other aspects of the performance goals, or is that the last piece? Great. I thought
we have
so.
3 more.
Yes, I thought so. Okay, good.
All right, I believe we'll have an overview from Deputy Superintendent Ringgold. We'll give an overview on the strategic direction B, and then Director Weissman then will give again a background on the numbers. But so I'll turn this over to Jennifer.
Excellent. Thank you, Superintendent Bangura. Be financially sustainable continues to be the focus of strategic direction B. And we have 3 performance goals within Be Financially Sustainable. The first one focuses in on basically a balanced budget, an equitable budget, and making sure that at the end of the day, we are being both balanced and equitable. It also introduced concepts around flexibility during periods of recession, even without knowing kind of the path we would take during this time period. That was thought about in that performance goal. The second performance goal for this strategic direction focuses on really new funding sources, trying to balance out our reliance on property taxes with other sources of revenue. And the third performance goal really was about, and continues to be about, maintaining our commitments and following the ordinances that we've put in place around neighborhood park maintenance, rehabilitation, and capital, as well as regional park capital and rehabilitation. So for performance goal B, there are several accomplishments to report out on performance goal B. This performance goal has been kind of the cornerstone of improved communications and data sharing between the park board and the city through several budget cycles now. It has it's been part of system expansion thinking in terms of how we look at those new parks that are coming online per master plans and other guidance, and how that looks within property tax increase projections. It is directly linked to directly links our budget requests to the strategic directions and the performance goals. And it has been part of what really, I think, was some of the underlying thinking between both the 2020 and the 2021 budget frameworks that we implemented during the pandemic to help guide us during that time period. In addition, it has helped guide us toward using excess fund balance to support full-time workforce, youth, and families and seniors and other COVID impacts. And it has guided us towards reorganization that focused more on frontline service or favored frontline service. Additionally, I would say that we did revise our financial management policies, and that was part of that was specifically around thinking about how we manage funds through recession. So that was another accomplishment in this particular area. Moving on to, sorry, I forgot that this slide was there. But this actually supports the last bullet of the previous page, which is taking the reorganization, looking at the changes that have been made over the last few years and seeing how it really favors frontline positions, as has been a deep request of the board over time. So a reduction overall in management positions by 4 FTEs, a reduction overall in office and administrative positions by 1 FTE, and an increase in field and frontline positions overall by 23. Those are significant numbers. Performance goal 2. This is around securing new and additional funding sources. So several items to report out in this particular case. I want to make sure this is still me. It might have actually switched over, and it has. So I will switch this over to Director Wiseman. I thought it looked a little bit less familiar, so there you go.
All right, so I am going to talk about performance goal B2, which is to secure new and additional funding sources, partnerships, donations, and grants. Some of our accomplishments, we defined our needs through the Closing the Gap Investing in Youth report, and we have completed all of our master plans, our service area master plans. We received citywide data on community preferences on funding sources. This board, through your adoption of budgets and other resolutions, have supported the Walt Dietzig Innovation Fund. You have increased this fund by over $300,000 with both ongoing and one-time funding. And this focuses on building community partnerships in recreation programming. We've had the establishment of new and increases to existing fees and charges directed in areas that don't impact youth. We secured funding for COVID and encampment relief through the city, the county, and the state. And then we realigned existing resources to establish the grant, donation, and program administrator position. Next slide. So commissioners have asked what is the history of grants and contributions here at the Park Board? And what I've put together is a 10-year history, just because I think the request was specifically for a 5-year history, but I've put together 10 years to be consistent with the other historical financial information that I've provided. What I needed to do was I actually went to our audited annual financial report to pull together this information. The amounts reflected in these charts are actual revenues. So it's when the revenues were received. It's not when the money was awarded. So not when the grants were awarded or the donations, but actually when the revenues were received. This first chart reflects all revenues received from all outside entities. So their operating grants and contributions, capital grants and contributions that aren't restricted. These are all generally accepted principles of financial reporting, and they're reported out on an annual basis. So this does include things other than grants and donations. It includes our local government aid. It includes city bonding for our capital improvements. But what is nice in the yellow line, which is the total of all these sources, is that it really is showing that trend of an increase over time. And you'll notice the sharp peak in 2017. And that's actually when we were able to quantify the value of the Commons Park as it was donated to our system. So that's why that peak was there in 2017. The next slide, please. So here I dug into the annual financial reports and looked at non-capital grants and non-capital donations. So for non-capital grants, our 10-year average was just under $1 million, and our 5-year average is just under $700,000. So you will see a downward trend in our non-capital grants. What I will say for the capital grants is that there are changes in available funding sources. There's also changes where those funding sources are recorded. And all of this impacts the amounts that we receive on an annual basis. For example, the highest point in 2010, there were a lot of federal dollars that became available. There was a movement for youth employment and youth initiatives and youth violence prevention that became available through federal grants, and that's why that was a large year for non-capital grants. Throughout between 2010 and to 2019, we have grants that come in and out of our system, especially in the environmental areas. The Department of Natural Resources has had a grant program, but it also has changed their grant requirements. and their grant processes over the 10 years, which has impacted the park board's ability to receive these grants. So there's periods of time where we're able to receive them, and then other periods of time where we're not able to receive them. We also have funding that comes in and out of our system from the Mississippi Creek Watershed District, as well as the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization, in various levels of support for AIS and the Minneapolis Green Team. And then finally, our youth employment support. State funding for youth employment has switched several times over the last 10 years. At times it has been provided directly to the MPRB, and at other times it has been provided to the city of Minneapolis. There's also been changes where it was a direct allocation and then it was a competitive grant program. And so there have been many changes which has resulted in a decrease of funding allocations over time. For the non-capital donation area, the 10-year and the 5-year averages are not much different. So it's right around $600,000 a year that we receive in non-capital donations. Again, in 2010 and 2011, you'll see a downward trend, and then you'll see it kind of level out, and then an increased trend in 2018 and 2019. Next slide. So now I will turn it over to Assistant Superintendent Schroeder, who will go over performance goal B3.
Thank you, Director Weisman. So this is relating to NPP 20, and the specific goal is to meet the parameters for neighborhood park maintenance, rehabilitation, and capital as indicated in the NPP 20 through 2020, and neighborhood and regional park capital rehabilitation goals. The accomplishments here are fairly straightforward. We report annually on the NPP 20 program, and it provides the key information about what we've done for every year. It actually compares it to the 2 previous years and indicates the progress we've been making through the program. And we report that to the BET and to the city every year. And as we presented that, it's clear that as we are getting into the program, it's beginning to function more normally, where we have an initiation of a project happening in a year 1 of the program with engagement and then engaging consultants and delivery of the program by year 3. And if you look through the NPP 20 annual report, that pattern becomes fairly clear as we look at the dollars allocated and the percentage of projects that are completed. We did make an amendment to the CIP last year relative to, but because of the COVID pandemic, that directed the work that would typically have been happening related to more intensive capital improvements. We delayed those until this year. And if you were to look at the CIP, you would note that there are a whole lot more large projects that are $600,000 to $700,000 or more, even up to $1 million or more per year being initiated this year, when we can be back and hopefully doing the more intensive engagement that those projects deserved. What we did is we replaced those projects in 2020 with projects that were more rehabilitation focused, where the engagement threshold was somewhat lower. One of the goals that was made for us last year was to begin the process of prioritizing lists for rehabilitation projects. We planning and particularly asset management has been moving through that process, and this year we'll be able to publish several rehabilitation priority lists. And we'll keep them as lists and not try to put them into years, because with rehabilitation, the dollars that have to be invested are never fully known until we start actually getting in to the rehabilitation project. But we'll set up the priorities and we will pursue them in the order that they happen in the list. The other thing that's happening relative to rehabilitation and repair that asset management is making significant strides forward is to generate the cost estimates based on service life of improvements so that we can begin to define more appropriate funding expectations. For instance, we know that we need to be redoing tennis courts and recolor coding those every number of years, but the costs to do that have been variable, and the sequence that we do it has left some courts in less than ideal conditions. So we're really looking at providing a more consistent level of service, but at the same time, making certain that we're projecting funds appropriately so we can do that. And as we noted earlier, as we're expanding the system, which is necessary to accommodate some of those growth areas that are happening in the city, we're assessing the costs of maintenance and operations for those new parks and actually beginning to more carefully plan those costs to make certain that we're able to accommodate them in the regular operations of asset management. And I'm not sure who this turns to next. I'm sorry.
Good evening. It's me, Assistant Superintendent Schroeder. So thank you. Speaking specifically to maintenance, with this goal, we have, Michael mentioned it, developed and I'm beginning to implement life cycle maintenance and replacement programs for like trails and courts. This is something that's been missing for a while. Director Evenson has worked with a consultant in Chris DeRoche and Brent Caff to do an inventory of all of our courts, do an assessment of their condition, and start to lay out a program, as well as with our trails, the regional trails. That contract is currently out for bid, where we would be collecting bids for that pavement work, be it seal coating, seal coating, strip and replace, or complete reconstruction. But we're starting to develop a program in that. And then in terms of service levels for snow removal, mowing, weed harvesting, graffiti removal, hort maintenance, and just meeting the system expansion with things like the commons, you can see our FTE counts. So you've also seen the improved snow removal and weed harvesting and mowing, but we've gained 16 full-time workforce in our asset management department that provide these services. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Deputy Superintendent Ringgold.
Thank you, Assistant Superintendent Barrick. And we want to talk a little bit about staff recommendations. So I'll take the first two performance goals and some recommendations, and then Assistant Superintendent Schroeder will take the next one. So again, performance goal 1 was based on a balanced, equitable budget. Our recommendations are to continue our work with the board in terms of developing the 2022 budget and ensuring that a recommended budget is provided to commissioners that is balanced by the superintendent. The information that we received from you today will help us inform will help us inform some recommendations that we'd be bringing forward, as well as the information we receive on day 2. And for performance goal number 2, this is the one that's focused on new funding sources. We'll be evaluating the successes that we have in 2021 and developing more focus on those areas for 2022. Assistant Superintendent Schroeder.
Thank you, Deputy Ringgold. So again, we're looking back to the MPP 20. So what's important for us in our recommendation is to continue that collaboration with asset management and planning to define the priorities for rehabilitation work. It's been the focus, the bulk of the work is actually being accomplished, as Assistant Superintendent Barrick noted, by staff and asset management, but we want to continue collaborating with them because we want to make certain that rehabilitation work and capital work are well aligned. We will continue to pursue donations for park improvements where partnering entities can be identified. this has been successful for us in projects, the most recent being the Morgan Avenue tennis courts, which we were finding difficult to secure aligned bids. We were able to work with Support the Courts and a neighborhood group to be able to have a contractor come in and build the courts at what I believe to be a far less cost than we could identify through our procurement processes. And we came in and did the work that was not aligned with the direct play surfaces. And it was able to deliver that improvement after struggling to find dollars to support a normal bid for at least a couple of years. And then the third point is that the NPP 20 ordinance, the concurrent ordinance we have with the city, allows an adjustment in the NPP 20 funding amount on a 5-year basis. So Director Weissman has directed a request to the city that would increase the amount of dollars that would be made available through NPP 20 in accordance with that ordinance, and it would bring additional resources to accomplish, potentially continue to accomplish the work that we have been doing in NPP 20, recognizing that the annual allotment through NPP 20 for the first 5 years has remained equal. What we did is we looked at both CIP changes and then actually worked through contractors to understand how their prices have been changing. So we shouldn't think of this as an increase, perhaps. It's an adjustment to relate to the increased costs that we were seeing in the market related to construction. And so it allows us to continue to perpetuate the improvements under NPP 20 at the levels that were happening in the first 5 years. And again, I apologize, I don't know who follows.
Michael, I believe that's it's me now. We're getting to the point, I think next slide, where we did on the first, when our first go on youth investment, is to now specifically ask the course President Cogill and commissioners for your input on the goals that are set forth by the board, the recommendations, and at this time to have any conversation around that. And we again will listen and take notes and respond accordingly. But this is the time now for you commissioners to look at the performance goals and give us feedback. In particular, I think we talked about performance goal B2 and goal B3. B1 will be, commissioner input will be obtained during the budget retreat on the second budget retreat that we have on May 12th. So President Cogill, we turn over to you.
Thank you, Superintendent. Are there any comments or questions from commissioners on these three budget-related financial sustainability goals, especially the second one and third one? So the goal around securing additional funding sources, and then the goal around the parameters for neighborhood park maintenance, rehab, and capital improvements. Any comments? Commissioner Forney.
Relief, somebody wants to talk to you. Wait a second. Oh, I am on. So do we have a projection of what the adjustment to costs are for MPP 20? Do we have any sense of that?
President Cogill, Commissioner Forney, the calculation that we did was actually done several months ago, but I think the amount that it's increasing, and Director Weissman might confirm this, was slightly more than $1 million. And if you were to just look at that compared to the dollars originally allocated, it's inflation that varied a little bit by year, and then there were some particular spikes in one year, I think. But I think it was a little over $1 million. But Director Weissman might be more immediately familiar with the requests that we're making.
And is that after 5 years, or is it the 5th year, or
We make the request in the 5th year, and that would apply for the next 5-year period, if it's accepted by the city.
okay.
Yeah, and I don't have anything to add at this point. That is, Assistant Superintendent Schroeder is correct. It's about $1 million.
I just, as far as what the levy projection is, I'm not going to quarrel any of that right now, but I do feel that performance goal number 2 or B2, excuse me, whatever is something that we just really need to be concentrating on. How do we expand that? How do we tap into funding? And I mean, I just have to express that I'm very disappointed that we did not pass the resolution for a federal lobbyist, because you know, well, we're probably missing right now the conversation that our president is proposing, and to align ourselves with that is just like, anyway, I won't say anymore, but that's all for now.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Forney. Any other questions or comments from commissioners on financial sustainability? I just had one question. I heard about Assistant Superintendent Schroeder talking a bit about prioritizing rehabilitation projects and how there wasn't really a priority listing. Could that be explained a little bit more again? What's
Sure.
the thinking behind not giving a year-on-year kind of proposal?
Sure, President Cogill, there has always been, to the extent that we can identify it, we've always had an internal prioritization based on like critical failures of systems or impacts that would limit programming in a recreation center. So we've always known about those internally. There was a request made by Commissioner Musich last year that we make that prioritized list public, and so we're moving in that direction. To the question about what happens with that list, rehabilitation is not necessarily programmed in the same way that we do capital improvements, where we identify a start year and an end year. We are starting from the top of the list with rehabilitation projects and taking those components or aspects of an asset that are in the worst condition and bringing them up to speed. And depending upon any number of factors, like if we look at the one that stands out in my mind are the ADA improvements we've been making in buildings. They're turning out to be significantly more expensive than we had anticipated, even though we originally allocated $800,000 a year for the first 5 years of the program to ADA improvements. When we look at trying to get in to do a bathroom in a recreation center, and it's costing $300,000 or $400,000 to make the ADA improvements that are necessary, the dollars just aren't going as far. So we have that list of the worst, and we keep working our way through it. If we were to say that if we were to try to project that we're going to get through A, B, and C in a particular year, we may not be able to do that just because the funds don't always allow us to get that far. But we continue to pursue them in the order of kind of the worst condition as identified through several layers of assessment. I hope that helps. Yep.
No, it does. It does. So be curious to dive more into that at some point. Some other point, I'd be interested to see kind of what the different criteria are, and just thinking about location, thinking about types of facilities, some of that stuff. But we don't need to do that right now. But I'll follow up another time. Other questions from commissioners? I'm not seeing any. Superintendent, you can move on. We do have, I believe, 2 more strategic directions to get through, and I'm looking at the time. We have about half hour to do so.
Right. Yep. Thank you, President. Thank you, President Cogill. I'll turn this over now to Assistant Superintendent Barrick and talking about protecting the environment. I'll turn it over to you, Jeremy.
All right, good evening. I will try to be quick, but this is a big one. So 2 primary goals, if you recall: reduce the carbon footprint by 10% and establish new targets by 2022, and establish lake, natural area, land, urban forest management plans that recommend sustainable and equitable service levels by 2022. So if you advance to the next slide, we'll start with reducing the carbon footprint. And there are several things that we've done here, and I'll just try to hit on the highlights. We've completed the building audits at the 5 buildings that were kind of our highest energy users. With those audits, we identified measures we could take to reduce the energy consumption. Those projects are in construction as we speak. They started in the fall of 20. We expect to wrap them up here early summer and spring 21, and you can see that we're looking at an annual savings of $100,000 in utility costs, and also the reduction in our carbon footprint by almost 3% with just that action. If you go to the next slide. Another thing we've done is hybrid vehicle purchasing. We've upped that. We've currently purchased 4 and have them in our fleet. We purchased a 2021 Mitsubishi Outlander at the end of the year in 2020. This is a hybrid plug-in vehicle. And then in late 2020, Ford introduced the hybrid SUV option for emergency responders. We did purchase one of those, and I believe it was picked up yesterday. So we now have a police interceptor that is a hybrid model as well. So making improvements in our fleet. If you go to the next slide, in this, we've continued to purchase electric equipment as well. Kind of the big one is the small UTV there on the picture on the right. That's a Toro electric battery operated UTV that we were able to purchase. So then we also have a couple of battery operated mowers. We did increase our electric tool fleet by 13. This was for the hook gardeners, I believe. The forestry operation also purchased some battery operated stuff, I think in 2019. So we're increasing our hand tools that are battery operated. As that technology evolves and gets better, we're taking full advantage of it. If you go to the next slide. And tomorrow we will have our first operational charging stations at the Southside Operations Center. So we installed 6 units with a grant program from Xcel Energy. They are putting power to those units tomorrow. And we will look to, in 22, we're going to continue to look for opportunities to add charging stations at our maintenance facilities so that we can support the build out of a more electric fleet. And if we go to the next slide. Well, the last thing that's worth noting, this is a kind of a highlighted program where we partnered with the Minnesota Green Corps and a grant from the Pollution Control Agency to bring on a Green Corps member, Rachel, if you may recall. But she did several things throughout her tenure with us where she helped to reduce our waste. She did complete the compost contest between rec centers to improve the organic collection. We also added a new community organic drop-off site. She did a lot of staff training with understanding the importance of sorting and what needs to be sorted where. She did some audits on dumpsters as well as our waste. And then with the Kite Festival, started to implement some of the event Go Greener standards. So some more improvements there to reduce our carbon footprint. We go to the next slide. So switching gears to goal C2 with the established lake, natural area, land, and urban forest management plans. We have implemented an operational inspections for playgrounds and rec centers that captures the data digitally and allows for weekly analysis of how those parks, playground inspections are happening, what conditions are out there. We have a framework for the urban forest management plan that will be recommended, that will recommend sustainable and equitable service levels. The water resource lead position, which was intended to really lead the charge on the lake plans, unfortunately was put on hold with COVID as part of the pandemic there. And then we will complete phase 2 of the natural areas plan in 21. We have a budget item coming up, I believe, May 5th, an update on that phase 2 plan that will include the management recommendations and estimated costs associated with the restoration and management of natural areas. If you go to the next slide, this is part of the urban forest management plan. Was to initiate a pilot program of mobile technology that expands tracking of forestry work. And so in 2021, all of our forestry work is now being digitally recorded. They used to use a paper triplicate form. A call would come in, customer service would fill out the form. Those forms were shuffled around to the service area. Today, Those calls come in and they're logged into the Davy Treekeeper software package. The foreman and the inspectors in the service areas have tablets. We purchased, I think, upwards of 45 tablets, and they're doing their inspections in the field on those tablets. The foremen have them for the crews to work from, and so you can just kind of see some of the imagery here. We're actually conducting our planting season in this digital software. So we're pretty proud of this. This is going to give us a lot of data in the end. It's also it's also increased our efficiency in the field. So that's a big one. And then if you go to the next slide. So our staff recommendations, starting with the performance goal for C1, the steps we see this year are to complete that carbon footprint 3-year average analysis to assess whether we've met our 10% reduction goal, and that number will allow us to estimate the next step for achievable goals relative to the 2018 baseline. So we're excited about that. Automate all of the utility bill data collection to the energy software we purchased a couple of years ago, Energy Cap. This will help us to maximize cost savings, flag errors, and identify high-use sites faster. And then we see, the next step of then looking at those sites and taking steps there to, roll out further energy savings initiatives. In terms of C2, the steps, water quality, I mentioned it earlier this evening. It's central to the identity of Minneapolis and the park system. And so a comprehensive plan that addresses the need of water bodies with consideration for the equity framework is needed. Additional funding is needed to accomplish lake management planning, including shoreline management, blue-green algae, and the completion of a diagnostic study that addresses the end of life of past management activities. And if we go to the next slide, I believe this is where I turn it back to Superintendent Bangora and President Kogel.
Thank you, Assistant Superintendent Barrick. Again, President Kogel and Commissioners, this is an opportunity to look at performance goal C1 and C2, and we look forward to, again, any recommendations or anything you'd like to talk about there. We'll take notes again and answer any questions. But again, we look forward to your recommendations or any insights to those performance goals going into 2022. President Kogel.
Thank you, Superintendent. Comments and questions from commissioners. Commissioner Meyer.
Yeah, first, it's great to see this progress. I'll follow up with staff after this meeting to get some more details about it. Don't need to take a whole lot of time tonight. But one thing I did want to get clarification on now is just the 3% figure that you talked about for the carbon emissions reduction. Was that 3% for the entire institution or just that one category?
President Kogel, Commissioner May, I believe that was 3% for the entire institution.
That is fantastic news for a single year. Outstanding. Thank you.
Yeah, I should say, Lyndon Vice Verda has done a wonderful job with the energy work. It's incredible. He's passionate about it and done a lot of great stuff.
Thank you, Commissioner Meyer. Any other questions or comments from commissioners? Questions or comments? Could we, maybe I missed this, but this performance goal C2 regarding the forest management plans or the management plans of different areas. My question is twofold. Did we have management plans for specific areas in the past? Do we have an operating one currently, or is this a brand new thing? And yeah, that's, I guess, the first part of my question.
Sure. President Kogel, my understanding is we didn't have management plans as a general, like, urban forest management. We had more specific stuff. So, and most of it was done through master plans or very specific areas where we would do an ecological restoration management plan for a particular area. But and maybe Deputy Superintendent Ringgold would know more, or if I've got this wrong, feel free to correct me. But I understand that we didn't have like an overarching, we certainly didn't in forestry, and in recent times, we didn't have an overarching like program plan. Your best bet was to go on our website and click through the pages to get a sense for what we're doing and what policies apply. And so we're really, in terms of the urban forest one, it's really about rounding up all that information, putting it into one spot. It's not going to be a management plan in the sense of, you know, we have this percent of species, we're going to grow it to X percent of that same species. It's not going to get to that level of detail, but it is going to get to the level of detail of we are diversifying our urban forests so we're more resilient type of stuff. And it'll also cite and reference like the ecosystem services plan, master plans, and the other plans that are out there.
Are there any tools or materials or approaches that we aren't using now that will be benefited by having a plan to implement in the future? Like, what are the tangible benefits of having a plan as opposed to just managing space?
Sure. So President Kogel, I would say that for the natural areas, I'm again really excited to have this natural areas plan because it sets a course for the various sites across our system that we consider natural areas. It tells us what's there, it tells us what it can be, tells us what it's going to take to get it to that can be. And when we have partners like the Friends of Mississippi River, the MWMO, who come along and they want to pursue grants, they'll be able to essentially plug and play. They'll take from our plan what our goal is and what we're trying to do. And rather than in the past, they would take individual sites and they would start from scratch at the individual site. And it was really hard to connect, you know, the landscape's a connected thing. So it'd be really hard to connect what you were doing on 1 or 2 acres to the neighboring 25 acres. And this plan allows us to kind of put everything in harmony and say, this is what we're trying to do, this is what we're setting the course to do ecologically.
Thank you. Any other comments from commissioners? I'm not seeing any. Thank you very much, Assistant Superintendent Barrick. Great to see all the progress and thinking on this. Thank you, Superintendent Bangora. Superintendent, back to you and the team.
All right, President Kogel, commissioners, we have one more for this evening. I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer, Deputy Superintendent Ringgold, for the Strategic Direction D, Engaging Communities of Power. Take over, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Bangora. So Engaging Communities Power has 3 performance goals. The first one is really a focus on our workforce and how our workforce from a race, ethnicity, and gender perspective lines up with the population of Minneapolis. The second one is really around engagement and how we continue to engage community in the work that we do from program, service, and project in an equitable way, and making sure that we're hearing from especially communities who will actually be using the facilities and be in those areas or part of the programming. The third one, we won't add a fourth one tonight. The third one is really about keeping the commitments. One of the aspects of continuing to keep community engaged and keep community working with us as an organization is making sure that the community voices we hear throughout our processes are adequately and clearly honored by making sure that we actually follow through with the plans that they help contribute to. So the last one is really about following through on those the community voices that we hear throughout the processes. Strategic Direction D, Performance Goal D1. This is the one that focuses on the workforce in particular. We've done some work in terms of accomplishments here where we focus on making sure we understand our current workforce demographics and understanding the demographics of the city in relation to those categories. We track those. I'll be able to show you in just a second the same graphics that are shown throughout our annual report, so it's also something we provide publicly. And this work has also really helped us through our response to COVID-19. One of the things that was really fundamental in a lot of the policies and the work that we did is we wanted to make sure that we didn't lose the gains we were making in terms of our workforce. So making sure that we didn't follow kind of last in, first out policies, trying to really retain our certified workforce so we wouldn't lose those gains. And then the final accomplishment I'll talk about on this slide is that as part of the reorganization, we have aligned our ADA, gender inclusion, and racial equity work into HR. Really seeing that that would be in a way to embed within our organization the work in these areas, ADA, gender inclusion, and racial equity, in the development, recruitment, and retainment of our staff. So the graphic that I explained I would be showing is also the same one that appears in our annual report every year. And it is designed to help us track how we are moving in terms of key categories of work, so whether it's office administrators, professionals, technicians, you can see all the others, including service and maintenance, and how our population, our workforce population, is aligning up by race and ethnicity across those categories. One of the things I do every year is I look first to see where are the changes happening. And so between 2019 and 2020, we see a slight decrease in the percent of our population that identifies as white. And the largest increase we see is the percent of our population that identifies as 2 or more races. We look at this from the perspective of the demographics of the working age of Minneapolis residents. So we look at the demographics of individuals between the age of 18 and 64. And within that, we know that the white population of that demographic within Minneapolis is 75%. So we're looking to try to balance the race and ethnicity across the organization to meet the city's demographics for the working age, 18 to 64. And with that, I will hand this over to Michael Schroeder, Assistant Superintendent Schroeder, to talk a little bit about the next 2 categories of this particular strategic direction.
Thank you, Deputy Ringgold. So performance goal D2 is to demonstrate that participants engaged through our CE policy reflect the demographics of the communities served by the program, service, or project, and ensuring that we're supporting equitable delivery of those program, services, or projects. At the board's direction, relative to the Parks for All comprehensive plan, we extended the engagement several months to make certain that we could cover potentially those demographics that might have been missed, particularly because of COVID. And so that process has been continued through the middle of this year. We established and engaged a youth design team, and they were actually very instrumental in several aspects of the comprehensive plan, not just in terms of engaging other youth, but actually producing policies directed to youth in the city. We've updated the community engagement policy, including, I think, significantly as we've looked to implement that, the use of CACs on fewer projects. CACs tend to take an inordinate amount of staff energy to direct engagement to a limited number of people, and we're refocusing that so we have many more opportunities to engage people in using the same kind of staff resources. Actually, what's happened, I think, during COVID is that we've learned new methods for engaging people that will perpetuate past the end of the pandemic. And most of those are focused on trying to more broadly engage the community so that we're not continually asking people to come together for 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 meetings to try to come to a conclusion on a project. We've worked to establish and engage a youth advisory council, and we've initiated framing of engagement for past CAC level projects so that we can incorporate those new directions as part of the comprehensive plan. And the next slide, please. The performance goal D3 is related to tracking and reporting progress relative to our our plans. We have initiated master plan tracking tools relative to all capital improvements, and they actually started with the service area master plans and the master plans, so that the implementation sections of those have been translated into implementation plans. Master plan champions from planning staff have been assigned to each service area master plan and regional park master plan, and they will be tied to every capital and rehabilitation project so that we can ensure that the goals that were intended in the master plans are being carried through to the actual delivery of the improvements. We've adjusted the CIP organization to reflect equity measures relative to site and master plan directions. We are continually looking at how we make certain that those metrics that have been established are appropriate relative to changes going on in the city. We have contractual services that establish system-wide coordination of data. And as noted previously, we amended the CIP to make certain that we were not limiting people's opportunities to participate. And also, as noted, we're moving towards hopeful completion of the comprehensive plan, the Parks for All comprehensive plan, as another means of tracking and reporting on the progress of the communities. Next slide, please. So I think I'm continuing on this one. Is that correct, or is?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. So on D1, relative to continuing to reflect the race, ethnicity, and gender of our working age population, we'll be focusing on seasonal positions for the period of 2021 to 2022. And importantly, as I mentioned previously, we're going to expand engagement using non-CAC methods to broaden participation of the community in capital and rehabilitation in capital projects. Performance goal D3, as I alluded to already, that we will be expanding upon what we've learned in COVID-19. As we've engaged with other park and recreation providers, we have learned that many of them were using several of the same methods. They were learning from us as we went through. Staff has done a great job in trying to keep people engaged in projects through many methods. And while we're certainly not expert at it yet, we have learned methods of engaging people through Zoom type meetings. And we will continue those even after we are able to reinitiate in-person engagement. And we are identifying staffing needs for urban agriculture related to community gardens. And this is where I turn it back to Superintendent Bangora.
Thank you, Assistant Superintendent Schroeder. President Cogill, again, this is the time that staff have given recommendations around performance goals, and this is an opportunity again for us to hear and listen to any recommendations or anything you'd like to add. We will listen and take notes, of course, and I'd like to turn this over to you and hear from our commissioners on our engaging communities of power.
Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, Assistant Superintendent Schroeder. And I'll ask commissioners if they have questions. Commissioner Forney, did you have a question? I see that you're, yeah. Go ahead, Commissioner Forney.
You can see I'm contemplating, huh?
Yes.
I'm very intrigued with the whatever D2 and excited about that. We've used our, shall we say, CAC. I hate that word. Anyway, methodology for so many years, and so I'm really pleased to see that we're looking to broaden. It's a white-centric way of processing things, and I really hope that we can expand on that. So I'm very excited to see that, and I would say that goal number D1 is very, very important. make sure that we are reflective of our community and nothing staged. I'm just encouraged. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Forney. Any other questions or comments from commissioners? Very good. I feel this is helpful. It's something that I would encourage staff to think about, and I don't know if it fits into these performance goals, and perhaps in the next year, commissioners can think about augmenting these. But my question or thought is around how can we identify programs or initiatives that are within the park system that are really community driven. So and how can the park board continue to expand and enhance those things. So when I think about community power, I don't just think about the diversity of our workforce. I don't just think about who we talk to about a project. I don't just think about kind of tracking where improvements are made, but I think about which communities have the ability or capacity or support from the board to make changes to the park system, to see themselves reflected in it and implemented in the system. So I guess an example of success there would be, maybe one of the recent mural projects or a community garden that was particularly kind of managed by and expanded by the Hmong community in near North, or if that kind of makes sense. Where are those spaces where we're seeing a community desire to make impact on a park space, and the park board staff and system is able to enhance that, is able to support that, is able to expand that. And I know that's not always possible. I know there are a lot of considerations, but to me, that's maybe the most tangible example of engaging community power is kind of lifting up community initiated projects. Just a thought. Right, I'm not seeing any other comments from commissioners. Greatly appreciate people staying around on a nice evening to talk through these things. I think they're really important, and I've gotten a lot out of this. So thank you, Superintendent, and your team for the presentation and the time that you put into this discussion and all the information that you provided. I'm assuming that this information is going to be available to us or sent to us afterwards so we can peruse it. And I'll turn it over to you, Superintendent, to close us out.
Thank you very much, President Cogiel and Commissioners. I do have one thing that I just was notified by, before I get my closing remarks. Director Weissman wanted to mention something real quickly. So Director Weissman, and then I'll close with my remarks. If I could turn over to her real quickly.
Thank you, President Cogiel and Commissioners. As we move towards our second day of our budget retreat on May 12th, a lot of the conversation is going to be around which of our priorities are we going to move forward with in 2022 related to the property tax levy and our property tax levy increase. We also know that this year, like no other year, there is going to be a lot of one-time funding that is available to the city of Minneapolis and potentially to the park board. And how do we best position ourselves and decide how we prioritize those dollars as well. So one of the things I wanted to just highlight for you, because I know that it was taken up in the Operation and Environment Committee last week, and it will be going to the full board on May 5th, which is before our next budget retreat, is Resolution 2021-194. And the resolution with doing the MOU with Green Minneapolis regarding the carbon offset program for urban trees. And I just want to mention it to you. I know, although I wasn't on the board meeting at the time that you had that conversation, but I know that there was some conversation around whether that should be one-time funding or whether that should be property tax funding. So I just want you guys, as I want the commissioners to really be thoughtful as you bring that forward to the full board. And, you know, as we look towards 2022 and really wanting to make a concerted ask and a significant ask for youth investment in property tax dollars. So I don't want, not that I don't want, we want to be careful. We want to have the direction of this board really giving clear direction on whether something should be a one-time source or something should be property taxes. As we think about growing the tree canopy, we all feel that that may be a priority that is moved forward at some point and at some level. But for 2022, we want to make sure that the property tax focus is the youth investment. Superintendent Bangor, would you add anything else to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Director Weissman. And I couldn't have said it better. It's going to be my closing remarks. Thank you, President Cogill. Thank you, commissioners. I really appreciate today and the discussion. I'm extremely proud of this organization, extremely proud of the strategic goals that we're putting forward and the accomplishments we're making there. I'm very, very proud of this board and your commitment to youth. We have invested a tremendous amount. And if we can go back and even look, the 1.6 million this board invested in, and that we are providing amazing opportunities for our young people, not only in jobs, but experiences, and not just recreation opportunities, but also learning and mentoring and growing. And if we talk about safety for our community, the park board is that lever we can pull. Our young people can come to our facilities. They can be involved in many different and interesting things that we're creating. These centers of innovative spaces. We're building our creation spaces out. We're very excited about that. And so I want to thank this board. I want to thank the staff. And I look forward to our next meeting. And we'll be talking about, of course, the focus on budget planning. And again, thank you for your time. And we really appreciate you all. And I look forward to our next meeting together.
Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.